Okay, so whenever you create any kind of surface, I'm just going to create a very simple surface here. Rhino automatically, depending on how the surface is created, will assign it control points. So this was a very simple surface that I just created, a flat 2-point rectangular surface. And if I hit my F10 key, or you can also go into edit control points, and you can turn the control points on or off. On is F10, off is F11, but I usually just hit escape to turn off the control points. That works as well. And so depending on how your laptop is set up, a traditional keyboard, you can just hit the F10 key. My computer, there are other controls that are combined with the F keys, so I have to hold my function key down and then press F10. Okay, hit F10. I'm Rhino. Okay, so then what it did there after I press F10 is gave me the control points for that surface. So not unlike the grit points that you can find in Illustrator to change those geometries or those shapes in Illustrator, where you have those little square grips. These act very similarly, although they work three-dimensionally. So I can grab one or two of these control points by dragging a window or just clicking on the point itself, and I can start to manipulate that surface. So I'm going to go into a different view, find that point, and if I just, I'll just start lifting it up. So you can see I've modified that surface. So I'm able to control that surface with those control points. If I wanted the surface to be a little bit more complex, right away you can see that that was a simple, we'll just redo that. Just lifted up that one corner, right? And the rest of the, basically mathematically, Rhino decided what the variation would be between that change and the other points that are still resting on the ground plane. So we have a slightly twisted surface there. If I wanted to be more finite with those kinds of manipulations, I can execute a command that's called rebuild. And so any surface as well, I can rebuild it, and I can add control points. So again, this is a simple surface. The control points were one at each corner. If I go into my build command, just edit, rebuild. So right away, Rhino's telling me the X and the Y, the U and the V here. So it gives me the orientation for that surface. Each surface has its own orientation depending on how it's constructed. And I can start to make modifications here to the point count, which is basically the control point count. I believe the default might be something like 2, and the default degree would be 1. Now the degree really is telling us how stiff that surface is going to behave once we start to make modifications. So if I have a degree 1 and make a change, the surface is going to behave a little bit more in an angular way, so it's going to be a bit more faceted as a series of manipulations. Once I increase the degree, you don't really increase the degree much beyond 3, although it depends. I've done it with 5 and 6, but beyond that it doesn't really come into play in terms of affecting how it's going to look. It's going to start to become more curvilinear. So if I increase this degree, say I increase it to 3, and I'll add, let's say I'll have 3 points that'll be both on the X and Y, or the U and the V for that surface, so the X and the Y. I can preview it. It's kind of hard to see the preview, although it is kind of coming through. It's just hard to see it. I'll hit OK. So now if I hit F10, I have a lot more control points. And if I select that same corner and make that same change I did previously, see, it's behaving quite differently, right? And so it's taking into account all these other control points, and now it's much more gentle of a manipulation that we're seeing there. So that's a combination of working with the degree and the control points. So I can back out of that and just show you rebuild, and I'll just bring this down to 1. I'll say OK. So this is the stiffer version. I'll take that corner, lift it up again. So we can see it's a lot stiffer, right? These maintain their rigidity. It's twisting a little bit because these other control points are pinned down. But we can see it's a lot stiffer as a manipulation as opposed to the other that was a lot more smooth. And so that's important to think about when you're creating different surfaces. I don't tend to, in the way I work with Rhino, I don't tend to rebuild many surfaces. Oftentimes I'll just recreate it, or it's a little bit more specific in terms of a profile, but it depends on what you're doing. This tool is used in a lot of different ways. Industrial design, jewelry design, there's a lot of like boat hulls that are created using Rhino, things like that. And so I can see maybe where you want to adjust, the streamlining of the hull or what have you, that could start to make some sense, but I don't tend to use that a whole lot. Another command that can be quite useful, it depends on how you're working with Rhino, but if you have an instance where there are two surfaces and you just want to connect them, right? Maybe the position that they're in right now is the way you want it, but you want those to be connected. Basically, you want to blend those together. And so, again, with Rhino, it's fairly intuitive what these commands are called, right? So I'm just going to type in blend. So the default here is actually for curves, so you can blend curves. I actually want blend surface. So I want to make sure I select that blend surf. And that's also, you can find that under the surface command. So I'm going to select that edge of that surface, this edge of the other surface, and see right away it's giving me some options for how it's going to blend those two surfaces. And I can begin to toggle and adjust a little bit of how curvilinear that is, or the positioning of it somewhat. So there are a few modifications that you can work with there. The defaults tend to be fine and start to work with the overall curvature of the surfaces that you're working with, and you can see seamlessly it blended those two surfaces. The other thing I think people that have been working with, or could have been working with a little bit more, and I showed a bit of this some time ago, but I'll just review different ways that we can scale objects in Rhino. I'm just going to join that quick. Let's see, I'm going to go into the top view. And so say this overall form is fine, but maybe I wanted it to be a little bit more narrow. And so there are a variety of options here under the scale command. And so there's an overall 3-dimensional scale, there's a 2-dimensional scale, and the 1-dimensional scale. Those are the ones I primarily use. Non-uniform I don't tend to use. Scale by plane I also don't tend to use very much. So I use these first three, which I think are the most useful. So I'm going to select the 1D scale. It's going to ask me for an origin point, so I'm just going to pick the base here. And then a reference point, I'm just going to go to the edge. And then I can really just scale this down to however I think may be appropriate. So then it becomes a skinny version of that. Now if I go back into my top view, so I can also do that, I should say. Here's the object. I can do that in any direction really. So I go back into my scale 1D, I'm going to pick the base here around where the top is, and I can begin to kind of flatten that down a little bit, bring the overall scale down. Let's see the difference there. I can also do what's called a 2D scale. So as you might imagine, depending on the view that you're in, it's going to scale it in those two orientations, origins, relative to the viewport. So here we're seeing the side view, so basically it's the Z and the X that we're looking at scaling down. I can scale that accordingly. So it's just doing in those two dimensions. Control Z, you can see that difference. And then overall, I can just scale this three-dimensionally. So in all directions, I'll go back to the same view. So it's just going to scale this overall down. That's a tool I tend to use quite a bit in Rhino, depending on what it is I'm trying to achieve. Okay, so just a few other tools that might be useful as you guys are working through this. Of course, things to keep in mind as we get through this project and on to the next. This is a file. I'll upload this for you guys. But there are a series of different, just little practice kind of vignettes here. Different ways to loft, sweep two rails with two profiles, the rotate tool. Here we have a rotate and a rail rotate basically there, so that can be interesting. Extrude along a curve, which was, instead of just extruding straight, we can extrude something along a curve. So that's something I might go over a little bit later, just as a series of quick little tutorials. A lot of this stuff you guys have been working with already, and the reason why I didn't present this earlier is, again, I think these can start to be kind of isolated. When you think of a rotate, automatically you think of something like we're looking at here, as opposed to something like what you guys are working on. And it seems as though that if you're trying to reach a goal and working with various tools to achieve that goal, that inherently lets that information be more part of your thinking as opposed to an isolated exercise to the side. So I'll make this available. You know, it's good just to kind of knock around and play around with some of these tools a little bit, but again, keep in mind that the overall notion here with the course is it's goal oriented, right? You're trying to achieve something in terms of design, and so we're exploring different various tools and workflows to achieve that. But I'll upload that so you can have that available. The other thing I just wanted to say is, how are the projects coming? Or ask. Coming along? I was getting the feeling that maybe a Thursday deadline would make more sense than a Tuesday. See how we just inched towards that? Okay, so we'll push the deadline for both courses to Thursday. Make sure again that you're concentrating on craft. You know, I know it's just a couple extra days, but with that, spend more time concentrating on craft, concentrating on working through all of the drawings, make sure those are crafted well, and also using Rhino to help set up those drawings and refine those drawings. In addition to adding depth with the layers of shade and shadow, at least gesturally, that you can get pretty quickly out of Rhino to scale, that can also be part of those drawings. So take note of that. And then the rest of the session, we'll just come around and see how you guys are doing. Okay? Any questions? All right, guys. Thanks.